After decades of fighting that's killed and displaced hundreds of thousands, will negotiations between the FARC rebels and the Colombian government finally address the underlying causes of the conflict? You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Ratansi. It's the longest ongoing civil conflict in the Western Hemisphere. Members of rural communities formed the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, or the FARC, in the 1960s in order to protect themselves from rich landowners and government-supported paramilitary forces. Now, nearly 5 decades later, FARC leaders and the Colombian government have once again gathered for negotiations to end the conflict, this time in Norway. During a press conference in Oslo, the Colombian government representative, Humberto de la Calle, reiterated that there will be no ceasefire until both sides reach a comprehensive agreement. But he did say that a societal transformation is necessary for talks to be successful.
La terminación del conflicto armado es la antesala de la paz.
The end of the armed conflict is just the initiation of peace. To obtain peace, we need to transform society, and we are ready to look for mechanisms that can guarantee the fulfillment of these aspirations. Another essential element is the implementation and guarantee of political participation.
During his speech, the FARC representative, Iván Márquez, stressed the talks cannot succeed unless the government deals with transnational companies who he says have robbed the country of its natural resources on the backs of the poor.
No se puede encadenar este proceso.
One cannot enslave this process to a policy that is only about obtaining gains for a few capitalists that don't care about the poverty that affects 70% of the population. They only think about increasing their fortunes.
Al Jazeera's Teresa Bo spoke to another of the FARC negotiators, Andrés París. She began by asking him why a unilateral ceasefire was not in place before negotiations began.
There
are two forces at the table that are confronting each other on the political, ideological, and military fronts. We are willing to agree that one of the first topics on the agenda should be the ceasefire, but not a unilateral one. We are willing to talk about a bilateral ceasefire, agreed under a formula that does not mean a defeat of the insurgency.
The FARC are composed of several fronts and blocs all over the country. Are all commanders supporting this peace process?
La FARC se encuentra más unida que nunca.
FARC is more united than ever. Today, the leadership team is meeting around the thoughts that were transmitted to us by the founding commanders of our organization.
What type of social reforms need to happen in Colombia for you to lay down your weapons?
Economic and social issues are at the center of Colombia's internal conflict. It's the socio-economic situation that's troubling our country, a capitalist country modeled on the developing neoliberalism that is sinking the old Europe. Therefore, we would characterize ours as an armed social conflict. Poverty is precisely at the root of the insurgents, the armed uprising. A final agreement must consider needs such as work, food, and education.
Let's talk now about another issue that is a big subject in these peace negotiations, and that is drug trafficking. The government of Colombia and of the United States have accused the FARC of being involved in drug trafficking. Are they?
The U.S. and Colombian governments are responsible for implementing policies that, instead of solving the drug trafficking issue, have fueled it and made it bigger. FARC has rejected drug trafficking since its beginning, but still our supposed involvement has become the main argument for political, ideological, psychological, and media intervention in Colombia. FARC is being blamed for this, but then you hear from the media that Bolivia's President Evo Morales is a drug trafficker. They have accused Chavez. They have accused certain left-wing organizations and revolutionaries before they accuse us of being Soviets.
I've traveled all around Colombia, and we've been to places where people tell us that the FARC control the crops.
No es así. Los cultivos de coca.
It's not like that. The coca crops extend across the whole country, and I can tell you about 2 big military bases that exist in the Caqueta region and one within the Putumayo region. And there is an all-seeing eye of American espionage, and thousands of acres of coca are surrounding this base. And it is not possible for there to be a guerrilla force because of the massive presence of the Colombian and North American military.
President Santos has suggested that he is open to discuss the issue of legalizing drugs. What is your opinion about this?
La violencia contra el narcotráfico como vía de solución.
What violence against drug trafficking does is increase the price of the narcotics in the U.S. and increase the profits of the groups tied to them. The work is a mechanism to pump up the internal price of the product. Let's legalize it, and it will stop being such a lucrative business.
There have been so many victims in this long conflict. Paramilitaries have killed thousands and thousands of people, but also there's been members of the FARC have been involved in what many say are war crimes or human rights abuses. What type of treatment do you think that these people within the FARC should get? Are you expecting an amnesty?
Es ridículo pensar que una guerrillera, una guerrilla exitosa.
It is ridiculous to think that a successful guerrilla who moves around in the jungle, that in the end he and his soldiers will wind up in prison. These are methods that apparently the government has used with paramilitaries. But this is a farce because other paramilitaries haven't gone to prison. The laws applied to other paramilitaries should be the same for us. We say that we are an insurgent force, and so a peace process must be built that allows us to move back into political life.
In 2006, the paramilitaries signed a peace agreement with the government. They were told that they would not be extradited to the United States, but many of them were. Are you afraid that something like this could happen to you?
La extradición efectivamente es una...
Extradition effectively is a landmine that could destroy the peace process. That is why we don't want our comrade Simón Trinidad in prison in the U.S., where he is judged for being an insurgent, a revolutionary, a guerrilla, because they could not prove his ties to drug trafficking.
So will the underlying causes of Colombia's conflict now be resolved? With me to discuss this is Jim Jones, a developmental specialist who's worked extensively in FARC-controlled areas. Marc Chernick, assistant professor of political science and Latin American studies at Georgetown University. And Virginia Bouvier, a Latin America specialist at the U.S. Institute of Peace. Let me first spell out the 5 issues that will be discussed during these negotiations, beginning with land reform, one of the initial driving forces behind the formation of the FARC in the 60s. As we heard earlier, rebels say multinational companies are exploiting Colombia's natural resources with little benefit for the country's poor. Other topics on the agenda: the rebels' future role in political life, how to bring a permanent end to hostilities, reparations and justice for victims of the conflict, and how to decrease the production of illicit drugs. Jim Jones, it's interesting that at that press conference, however, we were reminded once again of why the FARC initially took up arms, and those are fundamental issues of equitable development, which are at the heart of this conflict, and in many ways won't actually be addressed, though, at this conference. So what does that mean for the future of these talks, do you think?
Well, I think the issue of equity is going to come up, okay, in all of these points, okay, that the 5 points that are part of the negotiating agenda, and the land issue, the inequities of more than half a century, really were important in explaining why the FARC emerged.
Right, but I mean, when we hear Virginia Bouvier, then the government negotiators saying, oh no, transformation of society is needed. But when we also know that the entire economic policy of Colombia right now is based on the expansion of extractive industries, making it easier for multinationals to exploit the land, deregulation. I mean, that's a major conflict of interest, though, isn't it?
Well, there's a major conflict between the sides around this issue, and it's not clear to me how much in depth these decisions will be made at the negotiating table, or whether actually mechanisms would be created whereby Colombian society would be brought into these discussions to make the decisions. There is a line of thinking within Colombia, I think, that what's negotiated at the negotiating table has mostly to do with ending the armed conflict so that these issues can be addressed in a different way. So I think if the negotiators can come to terms with an end for the conflict, it will have to, in some way, address some of these issues, but it may be that it addresses it by creating mechanisms to address it, rather than deciding everything at the table.
But Marc Chernick, I mean, many of the abuses versus local communities, the killing of trade unionists and so forth, I mean, that's very real, as real, if not more so perhaps, in the 60s. companies employing paramilitaries to help with their extraction of minerals and so forth. I mean, it has to go hand in hand, doesn't it?
It does. You can actually unpack a number of things there. I think I'd fall somewhere in between Jim and Ginny. The negotiations are to end the armed conflict, but there's an agreement there will need to be structural change. But it is very interesting. The main issue there is agrarian reform, land, and not natural resources and extraction.
Which is why we heard, though,
exactly.
Iván Márquez mention it there.
And so what that tells me is that the two sides have agreed that there will be some structural change in some areas, particularly on the question of land where the government thinks that they actually can deliver. And they have ruled out to put at the negotiating table the issue of extractive resources and natural resources. There's a missing actor here, and that's the other guerrilla group, it's the ELN. And their primary issue during all these years since the 1960s has been petroleum and natural resources. And I don't think they will get to the table until this is actually put on the agenda. But this is going to be very, very difficult to negotiate at a negotiating table.
But I mean, but once again, I mean, it's integral to Santos's developmental plan.
It is,
right, yeah.
And so it's likely that they will get an agreement on land.
Right. Yeah.
And what Ginny says, mechanisms to put this into the democratic arena,
right,
with a broad array of forces from civil society and business and others. That's where that will go.
That'll lead us into political integration then. But before we do, though, James Jones, I mean, this is particularly your field. There is a land reform proposal on the table right now from Santos. Iván Márquez from FARC said he wasn't terribly impressed with it. But how effective does it look? I mean, is the government serious about land reform right now, do you think?
Well, I think they're serious in, at least as far as they've gone, okay, with the land law. At issue is whether that is going to satisfy the FARC. And one other thing with regard to the whole land and agrarian reform, this morning as I was listening to Iván Márquez, who is the chief spokesman for the FARC in the peace negotiations, the whole issue of territory or lands controlled by multinationals, okay, the multinational extractive industries, oil and mining, okay, which are major contributors, the major contributors now to foreign exchange in Colombia. And so he brought those in right when he was discussing issues of equity with regard to land reform. So I think, it's going to come in that way.
Right.
How it's going to be decided, I guess, is I don't know.
Well, that brings us to political integration. Virginia Bouvier, then Humberto de la Calle says, okay, we can talk about that, but first you lay down your arms, you get elected, and we'll talk about it in Parliament. But does that necessarily seem like a likely way that FARC they'll be satisfied with that guarantee that, lay down your arms, become a legit political actor, and then we'll talk about that?
Well, I think, the FARC has a history of trying to do this.
Right.
With the UP, the Patriotic Unity, back in the 1980s.
Right.
When they did lay down their arms, there was a ceasefire. They came into the political process, and some 3,000 of them were killed. Many of them were elected to public office, including Iván Márquez. And so I think that there is a tradition of accepting that if change is possible through the political system, the FARC will come into the political system and try to effect change. Much depends on security, whether they have the security to be able to do that, whether the spoilers who would want to prevent that from happening wreak havoc within Colombia in order to prevent that.
Juan Manuel Santos has talked of dark forces at work.
There are certainly dark forces.
So who are the dark forces?
Well, the dark forces are the people who would be most threatened by change. They're the large landowners, they're some sectors of the military, although I think that this government, the Santos government, has been very effective in trying to bring the military along with the process this time. That's one of the changes we see from previous peace processes, is that the military, instead of being outside of the table, are right at the table. And so I think that in some ways may avoid the possibility of the military being behind the table trying to overturn it.
And of course there's the former president, Álvaro Uribe, who doesn't seem too happy.
That's right.
And transnational corporations themselves, though, are they going to stand by if there's some equitable corporatization of the land in rural areas where all the minerals are? I mean,
the multinationals also have something to be gained from peace in Colombia. I mean, a Colombia that is secure, that doesn't require huge budgets for security and installations and guards, I think would be a much more productive and profitable enterprise. And so I think we can't put all of the multinationals into one bag. I think there's a lot of different interests within the multinational corporation community as well.
But there is that other point, Marc Chernick, that how much political influence is there now on some of these issues involving transnational corporations and the exploitation of land in the context of free trade agreements, and which almost give corporations, primacy over legislatures and politicians and so forth?
Well, it does, and these issues, I'm afraid, will not be resolved at the negotiating table. If you look at this agenda compared to the agenda 10 years ago with the FARC, there was a 12-point agenda where all these issues were on the table. This agenda is much more defined, and the FARC signed this agenda, and the issue of natural resource exploitation is not there. And so, again, what that tells me is that they can't negotiate the whole new country at the negotiating table. If there's major changes in the question of land ownership, 8 million hectares which could be redistributed, the country divided where there are peasant zones where you can only have small peasantry, and then there can be big agro-industry and other. There may be that solution they may have. The larger question of natural resources, that's not going to happen at the negotiating table. That won't happen. The FARC agreed to it. It's not on the agenda. So I think we'll have to accept that.
Let's move on to another point then, which will be discussed, and that's reparations and justice for the victims. One of our correspondents, Gabriel Elizondo, has more on that from Bogota.
What they really reaffirmed in Oslo was that there are 5 agreed upon key points that they're really going to focus in on in the peace talk negotiations. But one of them, and maybe the most complex, is how to provide some sort of justice to the victims of the FARC. And this is going to be incredibly difficult. As we found out here in Bogota when we spoke to some victims, it'll really give you a sense of the complexity of the issue.
We victims need to have a voice during the talks. We need to feel as though our voice is taken into account.
I ask God that President Santos and the Colombian government give us a delegate in the peace talks to be able to know where our kids are.
Well, we have to remember it's not just the FARC that are the ones perpetrating the crimes in Colombia. There are a whole host of armed actors here, whether paramilitary groups or armed drug trafficking gangs unaffiliated with the FARC, that have literally led to tens of thousands of deaths, displaced people, kidnapped and missing people in Colombia. So even if they are to reach some sort of peace accord with the FARC, and that's a big if, there are still going to be lots of problems with all of these other armed actors that are still out there.
Gabriel Elizondo there, and the numbers of those affected by the violence are very difficult to determine since much of the fighting has taken place in remote rural locations. But the Colombian government estimates that some 600,000 people have been killed by armed groups and security forces during 5 decades of fighting. The group Plowshare says that 3 to 5 million people have been displaced during that time. And Colombia Reports says some 55,000 people disappeared during the conflict. Jim Jones, though, I mean, when we look at those figures, it's interesting the media narrative, though, that we're seeing as these talks begin seems to suggest, at the very least, that FARC is responsible for most of this violence. But what is the breakdown between FARC, right-wing paramilitaries, the government who often supported them, and the military then, as we look at the vast numbers of dead and displaced?
Well, I think the statistics vary quite a bit, okay, depending on whom you talk to. But one statistic that I have read, which is accepted by a lot of people, is that at least the massacres, about 75% of the massacres are attributed to the right-wing paramilitaries and the government, okay, the two working together. And then the rest of it would be attributable to the insurgent groups. That's probably not an unrealistic figure.
When they talk there about reparations and justice for the victims, Virginia Bouvier, what does that mean in real terms, do you think?
Well, I think there are a variety of kinds of reparations. There are symbolic reparations, knowing what happened, for example, to your loved one. Relatives have disappeared, for example, want to know where their loved one is, and what the conditions that led to their death were. I think you often talk about truth, justice, reparations, and guarantees for non-repetition. So I think that what victims often talk about when they're talking about wanting justice is a combination of these four kind of pillars. They want to know what happened in order to prevent it from happening again. They want reparation, which could be material as well as symbolic. It could be an apology. It could be, I mean, there are a lot of different ways that we've seen reparations given in different zones of conflict. They can be, you know, memorials, or kind of a restoration of the dignity of the person who was defamed before they were killed. I think there's a whole range, and that's part of the discussion that will need to take place, both within the negotiating table, but more broadly in Colombian society.
Let's move on to another part of the agenda then, drugs, Marc Chernick. Very interesting to watch that interview that Teresa Bo did with one of the negotiators. But what is FARC's role with drugs? Again, it's something that seems to be oversimplified in the narrative.
It's very much so. If you listen to the U.S. Department of Justice, they say the FARC's the largest cartel in the world, and 60% of all cocaine in the United States comes from the FARC. There's no credibility to those claims. What the FARC does, and Jim knows this because he's worked in those areas, I've traveled extensively in those areas, the FARC is the major authority in the zones that produce coca. The peasants that have no other livelihood also work with the FARC. They control that part of the trade. It's the least profitable part of the trade. It doesn't make them international drug traffickers or all of that. Now, 10 years ago, there was a proposal that came from the Pastrana government that said they want a Marshall Plan for the coca growing zones.
Right.
But that regional idea was converted into what we now know as Plan Colombia, which turned that idea...
By the Clinton administration.
By the Clinton administration.
Right, yeah.
They turned that idea of working with the guerrilla to replace coca to a militarized approach against the FARC to get rid of coca. That militarized approach didn't work. Now is an opportunity to work with the FARC in the coca growing zones, and that will be successful. And that will change the nature of all levels of the drug trade in Colombia.
What was so interesting was to see a FARC leader sounding very similar to many other Latin American leaders right now on the subject of deregulation and legalization, I guess. So that seems to be something that is taking hold. We're running out of time, though, so let's just move then on to the permanent end to hostilities, Jim Jones. What's the likelihood of that? There is no ceasefire, even though FARC suggested today that they might be willing to institute one. But how do the prospects seem for that?
Well, I think this is a very risky area. Okay, in the sense that if the levels of violence reach a certain point, especially a point at which the civilian population is very adversely affected, then public support for the peace process will decline. And I think, you know, on the one hand, I can understand why President Santos is arguing that he wants to reach a certain closure agreements sooner rather than later. And sooner sometimes seems to be, if you listen to the government statements, 6 to 8 months. I think that's totally unreasonable. On the other hand, if the longer this thing goes, as long as there's no ceasefire, or an agreement, say short of a ceasefire that would reduce hostilities, then the risk increases that the public will not support it. So that is a very an area of a lot of concern. And I think the government is going to have to, and I think I'm hearing shades of this already, that this notion of, say, at least 6 months or 7 months or whatever, they may be backing away from that. But when they sit down and start talking, I think then they're going to really have to back away from it.
Another part of the media narrative, though, Virginia, is Well, the FARC has been so beaten down, they're in a terribly weak position. You know, the government has the FARC where they want them. Is there any truth to that, do you think?
I think there's acknowledgement on both sides that neither of them has won this war and that it could go on interminably. And both sides agree that it's time to put an end to it. And I think that's what makes this process different from previous processes. I mean, I think back in Caguán 10 years ago, there was some sense that the FARC could be coming into the capital and taking over in the same way that in El Salvador the FMLN might have done. That's not the correlation of forces today in Colombia, and I think people recognize that the war will have to be won politically in order for it to end.
All right, we're going to leave it there. Virginia Bouvier, thank you very much. Marc Chernick, thank you. Jim Jones, thank you very much too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And that's all from the team in Washington, D.C. for now. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook, where you can find more information about the program. And we want to hear from you. Tell us what stories you think we should be covering. Send your ideas directly to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net.